afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of where the legal meets the cultural. We're here with you every Wednesday, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you so much for tuning in, for sharing the show, for letting us know that the content is helpful as we navigate this very interesting world that we're living in. And we have our two legal experts here with us every single week to dissect what we see, give us information that's factual and not just the sidewalk attorneys, i.e., your friends on the street or the barbershop, and giving you what you need so that you can make informed decisions about what we see happening and how certain things affect our community a lot differently. My name is Dr. Stacey N.C. Grant. Welcome to the show. And I'd like to kick it over to my co hosts so they can greet you as well. Senor Pedro Pichardo Esquire.
Hello, buenas tardes todo el mundo. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm pretty sure that you're going to find the information we provide you with fulfilling as well as educational. Welcome.
Cha-ching, cha-ching, ding, ding, ding.
And he's back, Senor Russell. Welcome. Do you have any comments for our audience today?
No, we just got to underscore the line. I tell you, he got to trademark it. We got to make sure we protect it. How can we be on a legal show and he's letting that fly around like that? You know what I mean? if I see it on the shirt, I'm beating the person down. I'm like, that belongs to my man Ed. You know what I'm saying? Don't do it, right? That's number one. And then you mentioned something about, getting information from the barbershop, right? Sidewalk attorneys, right? Look, I commend anybody that's trying to inform the community, so I'm not going to bash. But check it out. When Ed and I go get a haircut, that's our downtime, man. We don't want to be tapping it all.
Oh, that's your disclaimer.
Can I ask you a question?
There we go. So let's get the show started right. You know what I mean? We're trying to get some downtime. We're looking for the hot towel on our face. We're looking for the shampoo on the head. We'll take 1 or 2, but give us a minute. Give us a minute.
Richard, how you doing, Richard? Roland said, "What hair?"
You know what I mean? See now, he remembered when I had it. You know what I'm saying? But the hair on my face, So,
Lord.
but you can understand what we're saying, right?
We understand
we're here for the community, but a little levity in how we roll here.
Well, look, that's why we have the show, so they can ask all the questions here or speak it legally without having to pay the fee of sitting down for a consultation with these attorneys. So take use and advantage of it. Make sure you tune in, ask your questions. You get access to both of them, and we appreciate you being here.
Can you get access if you're standing in front of the building? I just want to know, because you can, and then we need to hook it up. Easy note. We need to hook it up.
We're going to start the show today. Lord have mercy. Clearly, it is a hot summer day, and we appreciate you all being here with our two legal experts. We do have, unfortunately, not so fun news to discuss today. We definitely see what's happening with gun violence, and particularly there's been an uptick in a lot of areas, and we can debate why that is happening, but the fact that it's happening is really, it's heartbreaking because it's our kids, and it's our kids at varying ages that are getting access to these guns. And, between the governor to the mayor to local elected officials all across the country, but specifically here in New York, the DAs, everybody is working to figure out how we can solve this issue and really put some sort of pause to what we're seeing with the gun violence and the uptick. And it's really serious. We can't turn our head and say, well, it's not happening here. It'll happen in your neighborhood tomorrow. So you can't turn a blind eye to what's happening, but our two attorneys here have a lot of experience litigating cases on both sides and really understanding what we're seeing. The summer is always cause for concern in major metropolitan cities, but this is definitely, it's taking a turn that we don't want to see. We have enough with the Rona. The Rona is not gone. Even though people are getting vaccinated, it's still killing. The variant is still an issue. We don't need to complicate an already complicated world with gun violence. So what say you, Mr. Russell?
Well, one of the things that we often hear, and this show is not going to provide that platform. I'm letting you know that now. We're not providing that platform, which is for today, which is the social end of it. The part that is speaking to more jobs, things for kids to do in the community. I think that gets a lot of airtime, and rightfully so, because I think it's a way to suppress what we're seeing. And this is an unusual uptick of gun violence. And we're seeing it in our community on a regular basis. And we want our communities to be safe, but we don't want to be abused. But this time, I want to spend time, and Ed, please join me and Dr. Grant to spend time to really talk about the penalties of it. And what does it all mean, right? Because there is a disconnect between me actually shooting you and what the rest of my life is going to look like if I'm caught or when I'm caught. And what my life looks like when that person heals and wants to come back and shoot at you and maybe miss and hit someone else. So, I want to kind of talk about that so we have an understanding of what the consequences are, because I'm not really a big, parental timeout type of guy. I'm the type of guy that believe in the consequences. The consequences will dictate your actions going forward on anything and most things, whether it is positive actions, you do something for a loved one and they say thank you or give you a kiss on the forehead, that's a consequence and you move forward, or whether it's negative actions where, a negative consequences where you come out with that gun and you get arrested and now you got to go to jail. And so I think that's important.
No, and I, just to contribute to that conversation, even with those consequences, I think sometimes young people engage in behaviors that they have a hard time foreseeing the possible consequences until it's far too late. Sometimes even the action of sitting in a car with the wrong individuals could have life-altering consequences for some of these young people. And so, when you talk about the consequences, you also have to talk about the importance of wisdom and making wise choices, because the failure to do so can also have some very severe consequences.
And to your point, I want to do what Dr. Grant says. Let's put a pin in that, because that's the back half of our conversation. The front half is that folks do come and they want to get the information. And so they know, right? What are the levels when it comes down to having gun possession? If my kid has a gun and he's in the house and it's not loaded, but he's in his home, or maybe he's at his place of business, or you're an owner and you have a gun at your place of business and it's not registered, you could start off at criminal possession in the 4th degree, which is a misdemeanor. And for those that don't know, the definition of a misdemeanor is that you could be incarcerated up to 1 year, right? Usually those type of cases resolve itself in some type of probationary period, depending upon what your background is and what type of criminal history you have, if you have any. But since it was, I think was it the Sandy Hook shooting, right? It was the Sandy Hook shooting, if I remember correctly. At that time, after that shooting, New York then went in and codified and made changes to its gun laws. And so now you have 265-01B1, which is like a subsection of 265-01, which says it's a misdemeanor to have a gun in your home. Now, 265-01B1 now says it's an E felony. Now, let's just put this in context before I define what we're really talking about. For those who don't know, there's a big difference between you applying for a job and you have a misdemeanor. Even though it's criminal possession of a weapon, understand criminal possession of a weapon, when it's a misdemeanor, gives you a little shelter from the rain in that it doesn't tell you what type of weapon. It could be a knife, right? It could be a screwdriver that is
nunchucks.
Nunchucks. It could be a star. It could be one of them kung fu stars. It could be a shotgun, 2 barrels, 16 inches, 2 barrel, 18 inches. It could be I think there's some modification as far as a gravity knife, but it could be a switchblade. So you can get over with the criminal possession of a weapon in the 4th degree in your lifetime as you apply for jobs and as you try to describe what went on. But when you get to 265-01B subsection 1, there's no two ways about it. We're talking about a gun. And so I will read it. It is a E nonviolent felony. That means nonviolent really designates where you go when you do your time, if you go to do prison time. Nonviolent allows you to do programs, whether it's shock program, which is like a military program while you're in Rikers, or some other program to lessen the amount of incarceration time. But
but it's also an indeterminate sentence too.
Right. And it's also indeterminate. That means that there is no set number. There is no mandatory minimum. There is no mandatory maximum. The court has at its will to devise even a probation period, which would be 5 years if it's a felony versus a misdemeanor, which is 3 years. But it is still a felony. So I'll read it when, is a nonviolent is when you have a gun in your home or place of business. It doesn't matter whether it's loaded or not.
But it has to be operable, right?
Right, but it has to be operable. But it doesn't matter whether you say, well, that was in my house.
Wait. Pause. Mm-hmm. If it has to be operable, let's just break that down. You said whether it's loaded or not. Let's rewind the tape and come again so people really understand what that means of having it and what operable means. If we could just,
Okay, so with the operable.
That's Jose was asking that question.
So where does the right to bear arms come in if you can't have a gun in your home? Well,
Jose, before Ed defines something, there's a difference between having a licensed gun in your home and having a gun illegally in your home.
Yeah.
So bear arms doesn't speak to that. Bear arms speaks to, it assumes that you're going to go through the process to own the arm. It's not assuming that you just go into the shed and just grabbing the nearest rifle you got and just bringing it into the house. So that's the difference.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little more about sometimes people think if they have a gun license in another state, it's reciprocal in the other, which it is not. But we'll talk about that later. But in terms of operable, whenever there's an arrest for gun possession, law enforcement will test that weapon to make that gun to make sure it's operable, that it has the capacity to fire. And if it does not, then that affects what the DA is going to charge ultimately in the case, because in terms of 265.01-B, it has to be operable.
Right. And to add on to that, when you talk about loaded or unloaded, the law is like, if you have ammunition that's next to you, and you got a gun that's on you, that's a loaded gun.
Yeah, because sometimes individuals think that, but the bullets aren't in the gun. I had them in my pocket. Right. That's not going to save you.
That is not going to save you. So now you're looking at a Class E misdemeanor. A Class E felony. But here's something that I want to hit folks over the head so they remember this. The DA then has the right to do what we call a bump up if you have a prior misdemeanor. It doesn't have to be a prior gun misdemeanor. It just has to be a prior misdemeanor. And people think, I don't have a prior gun, I don't have a prior felony. No, you can have an assault, you can have criminal mischief where you destroy some property. If the DA deems it necessary, and that's why it's important to go back to the elections and who you're voting for, who's in power, and understanding what the policies of different boroughs and bureaus and counties are, because that assistant district attorney who's taking their orders from the DA. And once again, we want to congratulate AB on his victory as far as at least the primary is concerned, running for Manhattan District Attorney's Office. And I don't use his full name anymore because we like this now. I just call him the A to the B. The A to the B. The A to the B is cold. It's cold. That's how we talk. The A to the B. Boy. Let everybody look that up for a minute. Ed know what I'm talking about, right? So in this case, if they bump you up, now you're looking at a more serious charge, and you're looking at criminal possession in the 3rd degree. And now you're looking at
felony.
Now you're looking at a D felony, and that's a violent crime. And now the numbers come into play. You're looking at numbers.
Minimum 2 years, maximum 7.
Right. You're looking at 3.5 to 7. And before you were talking about probation. And before then you were talking about a misdemeanor where maybe you got probation or maybe you walked out, with nothing. And this is so serious. So everybody understands that almost each district attorney's office has their own gun court.
And I just want to point out, folks, that with respect to that third degree, that D, some of the things that will cause that bump up, if you will, is if the gun is defaced. A lot of our
Right.
young people, unfortunately, they're purchasing these guns or being given these guns on the street. Serial numbers scratched off. That in of itself will cause that bump up to that D felony.
And so let's go to the rationale, right? So I was a former prosecutor for a period of time, state and federal, and then I started to do defense work. I think Ed, you was always no, Ed, you did it in reverse, right? So you was defense counsel first, and then you went under Ken Thompson and became a prosecutor, right? So we kind of flipped it.
Yeah, and I'll tell you something. At the beginning of my career in the mid-'90s was when I started to see these gun courts come into play. And it was actually distressing as a defense attorney because now all of a sudden these prosecutions were accelerated. Usually had two judges assigned to that court. So now you didn't have a diversity in terms of sentencing. Things became very standardized, which in many cases is not good for us, right?
Yeah, no. I think you're hitting it right on the head. The ramifications.
Because there's a less of an opportunity to get that judge to accept those mitigating circumstances when it's the same. It's the same type of case coming every single day. That's all they're dealing with all day. They start feeling some sort of need to standardize the sentences in terms of as opposed to looking at each individual person that's coming before them and their particular circumstances, needs, family background, etc. So,
and I think to your point, I like to think that justice is flexible and not rigid and not fixed. And when you have these type of courts, you get into that fixed, rigid scenario. Now, I will say, one should always know thy judge. It's better to know thy judge than to know the law. We always hear that all the time. And the reason why it's better to know the judge than the law is that if you know the judge, then you'll know two things, whether that judge follows the law or whether or not you can hit that note, you can hit that theme, you can hit that narrative that judge will assimilate to or understand and therefore do something other than as they do in Manhattan. Because you could have a gun in the Bronx and you could have a gun in Manhattan, and in the Bronx, they may offer you a program. In Manhattan, it's flat, 2 and 2. You're doing 2 years jail, you're doing 2 years post-release. You take that same person, have that gun in Queens, you might get a 3 and 2. You take that same person, and you go to Brooklyn, you might get a diversion program. And so the fact that it's not uniform also creates a chaoticness as to trying to resolve it. And so to the degree that they have these gun courts, I'm kind of pro and against it. I'm pro in that you do have one judge that will see a repeat offender. You come in the day with that gun and I give you whatever probation, I look the other way, or whatever we resolve it, however we resolve it. Judge, he lives in the projects, or he lives over here, he goes to prep school, this is what's going on. And so, all right, I get it. Or it really was his brother's or what have you. He grabbed it from the shoebox. You get that one time. Now, if I see you again, now we got problems. And so I think to a degree, having a judge just manage those type of cases are helpful. But I also agree with Ed on the other side is that if you do something long enough, police officer, defense counsel, prosecutor, you name it, you start to become jaded. And the fact that you don't even know that you jaded shows that you jaded.
Yeah, and the thing to keep in mind is here that we're not dealing in absolutes, of course. In some of these gun courts, you will get a judge who becomes familiar with the cases, kind of realizes the social background reasons why these individuals are coming into their court with these charges, and possibly it has an effect of triggering that judge to really put pressure on the prosecutor and just the criminal justice system as a whole to try to find alternative sentencing schemes that will deal with that. I mean, in particular, in Brooklyn, when I was chief of youth diversion programs. I was running 2 programs, one called Youth and Congregations in Partnership and another one called Project Redirect. And both programs, with some slight differences, basically provided alternative programming to young men and women, who were charged with, gun offenses. And the idea there was to provide, counseling, to provide, support in terms of, finding employment, educational support if that young person wasn't in school, to get them back in school, or to enhance whatever programming that they have, do that family counseling and get the parents in, or whoever it is that's that child's guardian in, and to kind of talk about, well, what's going on here, and to provide that, real counseling, because a lot of these young men and women, came with a lot of trauma or a lot of baggage from the communities that they came from. Some didn't come from, bad communities or bad backgrounds, in terms of the family, but that there were underlying issues there that needed to be dealt with. So, like I said, we're not operating completely in absolutes, so kind of like that idea of for and against, that's kind of my mindset too, under the right circumstances. And at the beginning of my career, what I was seeing was more so this idea of, well, this is the plea, this is it, this is what we give everybody, we don't care who it is, because we have gun violence occurring in our community. And it was like, whoa, wait a minute. So you would have to kind of figure out ways to try to pressure that DA to offer a better sentence, possibly litigate cases in a way that you wouldn't normally litigate under normal circumstances, but you would have to, only because things have become so rigid in terms of the plea offer and what your particular client in my instance was facing.
Yeah. I think Dr. Grant is trying to tell us something, but she's on mute.
Oh, yeah, I muted myself because of background noise, and I'm busy trying to get in and can't get in. So I'm like, great, I can't hear me. But yeah, you got the joys of live television. So when you pushed a pin earlier, Mr. Russell, on what Mr. Pichardo raised, I want to circle back to the underlying conditions and the impacts that create these situations where our kids are not properly supported, so that there are programs and policies that are in place in order for them not to be touched by the criminal justice system. So like we said earlier, we can't get into all of that on our show. We're drilling down on what you're explaining with these different pieces. But I really want to circle back to the beginning when you said innocent people, they're in a car, they don't know, something can go down. And also the effects of a stray bullet that randomly hits. We've seen that play out. And then on top of that, the underlying challenges of mental health. We watched a news story where there was a accident, the person driving recklessly that hit somebody else, the cousin was down the street, heard the commotion and came running, didn't know what happened, and shot the innocent person who was hit by his cousin's car. Like, these are the things that are happening that we see headlines across the country. It's not just New York. So understanding what it means, what the law is, how this can become a felony versus a misdemeanor, what sort of defense you have if one, like, all of this really needs to be talked about in our communities with those that might know the people who have weapons, know that their family members or friends that, what do the kids say now? My sons would be mortified if I said, are they packing? Like, I don't know what the term is now, but you know people who have guns. And that's always what the churches, the police department, everyone's trying to get you to turn in. We need to just have these conversations broadly so that they can hear and understand. It's not that simple if you get caught. It's not that simple if you're in a car and somebody else is carrying a weapon. It's not that simple if you're in the wrong place or wrong time. There are real consequences. And I think that's the part that we really need to drive home as we see what the headlines are saying all across the country.
Well, I mean, we're speaking to it directly. Like, if you have a misdemeanor, you might walk out of here with probation. But if you get that bump up, and that bump up now makes it a felony, you will, and depending upon the jurisdiction that you're in, and when I say jurisdiction, I mean whether you're in Manhattan or whether you're in Brooklyn, you might do jail time. one of the things that is interesting is that if you're going to do jail time and you belong to a gang, and half of your homeboys are in jail, the deterrence factor and the consequential factor kind of is diluted because you're going to see your peoples, to a certain degree. And although I'm saying it as if I'm saying good morning, that's some of the psychology that goes around, or you're so focused in the moment that you're not even seeing the end of the block. And so one of the things that you brought up, Ed, in reference to a criminal possession of a gun in the third degree, you talked about scratching off. That's a reason why they will bump it up and make it a felony. So let's make sure that the scales are even. There's a rationale for that. The rationale is that if the gun is defaced and the serial number is scratched off, then that means the police cannot trace back where that gun came from or whether that gun was used in some other crime. And the presumption is that if you scratch it off for a reason, right? If you bought it and it was scratched off, you bought it scratched off for a reason. And that's the criminal side of it, is try to backtrack, whether this gun was used in some type of violent way, as opposed to just coming up from another state and made its way to your hands. And then when you're talking about these gun possessions and we talk about these conspiracy theories of what the government may or may not have on us and how our kids are being pulled over illegally and forced to give their information. Now the information is in the system. When you get caught with a gun, it's automatic that you got to give a DNA swab. Period. That's it. DNA swab. Automatic. You get caught with a gun and it is a felony, you got to give a DNA swab.
Across the country?
Well, in New York. Now, I don't know about across the country. You got to give that swab. So, for two reasons. One, tracking. If I get you in the system, they want to track you. And two, some people try to have the defense. I don't have the gun, touch the gun. It wasn't mine. So you talked about a gun being in a car, right? There is this theory called the car presumption.
Well, a constructive possession is
it's a combination, right? Yeah. So the car presumption is that if a gun is in the car, it is presumed that everybody in the car owns that gun. Until, and I understand the rationale, until someone stands up and says, that's my gun. And then even then, the district attorney may hold out because we know people are slick, right? Dr. Grant got a prior felony and Ed doesn't have a prior felony, and your two are in the car. Ed may say the gun is his to preserve the fact that Dr. Grant may have to do more time because you already got a felony or a misdemeanor in your background. So there is the car presumption that it belongs to both of you. And just because someone stands up and says, oh yeah, it is my gun, not his, doesn't necessarily mean that the case is going to go away. And as to what Ed said, constructive possession, that's part of the theory. Everybody owns the gun because you're in vicinity of the gun. You
have some sort of dominion and control.
Dominion and control. You have it. Just like if, people understand this. You drop $5. $5 is on the ground. It's near your foot, right? That's my $5, right? Everybody's fighting. That's my $5. What do you mean? It was right next to me. I dropped it. It was right there. All type of stories come up. Now you put that gun in that same place. What stories you think you get? I don't know anything about it. That's not mine.
and just to expand on the DNA part of it, what ends up happening is that if that person doesn't want to give it up voluntarily, more likely than not, that prosecutor will get an order from the judge ordering that person to submit that DNA sample so that
now to that point, defense counsel has a right to object to it, but there ain't really much grounds that you could say against.
It's very, very tough. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's very tough. And this is, you also got ballistic testing that they do on the gun, even in the event that, it's scratched off. They try to find some way of matching, those ballistics to that gun in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes that DNA is collected surreptitiously.
Yeah.
Would you like something to drink?
Yeah.
Then later on, after you leave the interrogation room, that cup is collected, the straw.
And the theory behind that is so everybody understand. Yes, it is trickery, But the theory behind that is that if you left the straw, or you left the cup, or you left the Poland Spring or Evian,
You have no
or
expectation.
whatever, if you leave that bottle there, basically you abandon it.
Yeah.
You said, look, I don't need it. I don't want it anymore. Well, if you don't want it anymore, even though the question is not asked to you, do you want that bottle? No, you just assume I drink it and I put it down. Now you take me in another room. Oh, so now you don't want it. You abandon it. So now I can take it and I can examine it. Right. And so as we educate the community, not necessarily to get over, but to understand that when they say, hey, look, you want the McDonald's, you want the fish and chips with the dips, you got to understand what that may mean, that you're
collecting DNA.
Right. And let's just say, and this is over and above the conversation that we're having about guns, just in general, right? You get trespassing and what have you, and they want to squeeze you for some information because they believe that you belong to a gang, and they offer you something to eat. And you sit there, and now they have your DNA. It's a variety of ways of doing it. I just want to clarify one thing. When I spoke about the criminal possession in third degree, and you having the prior felony and the prior misdemeanor, it has to be within a 5-year period. So if you have that prior and it's 13, 14, 8 years ago, 12 years ago, no, that's not necessarily room for the bump up. But if you have it within the past 5 years and you get this other charge, then you get the bump up.
And by the way, there's also a bump up in terms of the amount of firearms that you have too.
Right. If you have 3 or more, right.
Yeah.
Right. Correct.
So
correct.
you also have that issue.
And at this point, if you got 3 or more, you know what I'm saying? Like, come on, do you deserve the bump up? I mean,
this
right?
is it. Oh wow, it's so much to unpack in this whole conversation of understanding that even knowing that your DNA could be used, like you need to be aware of that. I just find that some of the young people, when we're talking to them, they think that they know so much, right? That there's a slick way to get over and there's a way to do this, and I'll just make sure my man does this or my girl. And they really need to understand my father says it all the time, you get by, but you don't get away. Like it will catch up with you. It's much better to not even get yourself involved, not even being around. I don't know how many.
I'm a little scared of that saying right there. What's that saying again? What was that?
Get by, but you don't get away. My father is always saying that. So it might roll good for a minute, but it will come back and bite you in the you know where.
I've been training all this time, running as fast as I can.
Can't get away. So we really need to have some, we call come to Jesus moments with our young people to understand you're playing with fire. We know what happens. Guns, there's no good that can come out of possessing a gun. That's how I feel. And I know some folks for protection and other reason have them, but it makes me so uncomfortable because you never know how things will roll out. Hey, Rolanda, great to see you. So understanding just in the small talk, in these conversations, that kids, there's a way to trace. It'll get back to you. And if you get pressured, we saw what happened in some of the public cases of how you get pressured in an interrogation room because they want to get to who killed XYZ person. And especially if it's a high profile case, especially if it's in a city like a metropolis like New York, where all of this is going to make the news. And we just add more complications to an already difficult world that we live in. So this whole conversation about 2021 being the worse than 2020, let's start talking about some of the other ways that we can inform and hopefully derail some of our community members to even be engaged with gun violence.
But Dr. Graham, we don't even stop there, right? Because we only talked about fourth degree and third degree. You understand what I'm saying? Right? I mean, we got to step it up, right? Let's keep it going, right? So now you're talking about possession of a gun in the second degree. And that's what we're seeing out here. We're seeing folks with loaded guns, right? So you possess a gun, which is loaded. And we already described what loaded can mean. Loaded can mean you can have a gun on you and it's not actually loaded, but ammunition is by your feet, right? Or you can have a gun by your foot and the ammunition by your foot. And under the theory of the constructive possession, there you go. Maybe not a strong case, but there you go. But when you have videos of folks actually shooting, then you have possession with intent to use against another. And that's clear if you running across the block and you popping off at somebody. I mean, that's like You can't even deny that. You know what I mean? Like that's easy, and I believe the minimum on that is 7 or something like that, or 15. I know.
My understanding is it's 3.5
3 and a half,
minimum,
right?
max 15
Right.
years.
That's right. So 3.5 if you have no priors, 15 years of the max, right? And so
15 years.
15 years. And so you can imagine, and we just talked about how different boroughs, it's not even uniform, right? So in different boroughs, you can have in Bronx County a gun and get this result. Brooklyn have a gun and get a different result. Same facts, right? And this is what can happen. And I'll just share a story with folks out there so they understand. And if there's 3 stories to really bring home what you were saying, Dr. Grant. The first story is, and this happened to young men that was in Manhattan. These young men, they were graduating college. They just graduated a fine institution in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, you got several fine institutions, but you have UPenn, you have Drexel, you have LaSalle. Let's just leave those 3. You have Villanova. Let's leave those 4 in there, one of those 4 institutions. And the day before their graduation, they figured they're going to flip to New York City and party out. They were going to graduate on a Saturday. They're going to flip to New York City on a Friday. So they drive to New York City. Philadelphia ain't that far, 2.5 hours, an hour and a half, depending upon who you're talking with and what you're doing, right? You get here in no time. All of them had their guns in their cars. Licensed owners from Pennsylvania, registered and everything. So round robin to your point, Ed. They registered everything in separate cases, you name it. In New York, they don't care about whether or not you have a license or permit from another state. You have a gun in New York, and we already talked about it being loaded and separate ammunition in one place and the gun in another place is still considered loaded in New York. And these 3, not 1, but 3 individuals. And there was a prosecutor who was African American. I want to point that out because we always see things on very surface, black and white. But this prosecutor was an African American in New York City. He felt that all 3 of these guys needed to take felony pleas, and they were engineering majors. One was going to work for Nassau. All of them take felony pleas, and was telling us that we're lucky that they're just getting probation. Because if you take this to trial, what the outcome is going to be. And so that's how being in a certain jurisdiction can work against you, because he knew that the jury of the peers would not be folks from Harlem, who would say, hey, man, what are you doing with these African-American males? They had their stuff registered. We know, but they're not, my man Slick Rick off the corner that's shooting stuff. Like, what are you doing? Right. He knew that he would have a jury that would think otherwise, and their life would be destroyed easily. That's one case put to the side. Another case in the Bronx, guy comes from Philadelphia, Latino brother, comes in the Bronx, has a gun. We're able to work out probation. We're able to get him 5 years probation. Shows his work background, shows that he's been doing positive things. Yeah, I had the gun. We ain't even gonna talk about how the stop was bogus, but yeah, I had the gun and I didn't realize it was still in the car. And whether he's factual or natural, we take it for what it is, but a different outcome. He got 5 years probation. Still had a felony misdemeanor. Felony conviction. Could not get them to give him a misdemeanor. They didn't see it my way all the way, but he got 5 years probation and he moved on, right? Then you get the third scenario where individual, and this is in Manhattan once again, he's with the gun, he's in his home, whatever reason they get there and they find the gun. The DA wants to give him a 6-month split. So everybody out there, let me just explain what a 6-month split is, since we have time on our hands, right? And it's our show. How about that? 6-month split is you do 6 months in jail, which really means 4 months, but you do 6 months in jail. And then the other 4.5 years, you do probation. So what I say to that is that makes no sense at all. The DA was convinced that he was doing me a favor in his brain. But to me, that made no sense at all. And you may say, why say you, Royce? This is why I say. If a person is eligible for probation, you deem him worthy enough for probation. That means that person could be rehabilitated. They made a mistake. We have to penalize them for something. And so we give him probation and we see how his life turns out. Then if you're willing to say that he's eligible for probation and you support that, and he's working and has a family, why do you want him to do 6 months in?
And you know what that reminds me of? May he rest in peace, Ken Thompson. You know what he used to do? He used to make his prosecutors go and do a tour of Rikers so they could see where it is that they're considering sending the people over whose lives they have the power to take away their liberty. Because, in many instances, the idea that, it's 4 months, it's 6 months, it's jail, it's not prison. For some people, that can be just completely life altering, given the level of violence that you have.
But it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense.
If you believe he's probation eligible,
destroy your life, right?
So you take a positive person from an environment, positive working. You're taking the support, contributing member, right? He had a gun. I ain't gonna deny that he had a gun, but he's contributing. He's financially putting his money on the table to help his family. You want to remove that, right? A person that you think has qualities that can redeem themselves, but forget that. We'll just put that on the shelf. Have him go and do 4 months. What do you think is going to happen when he does 4 months? Crip, Blood, Latin King, whatever name you're going to Sector 5, Sunny Valley Boys, you name it. Somehow he gets down with somebody because he got to protect himself for the 4 months. And then he comes back out. And then what? Can't get the job because he lost the job he had because you put him in. The job would probably work with him if he just had probation. Go ahead, man. You need some time off. Go take care of your business. Come on back.
Yeah, this is... every time I hear it, and because of some of the other work I do, knowing what happens on the other side, it's heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking, even to listen to the gentlemen who were graduating college, like the night before the big day, what you work so hard for, could all be taken away in a moment. Just not having that knowledge that, yes, you're a licensed carrier in one state, not being aware of what the laws are in another state that you travel to, or another country, for that matter. So that's why the show is so important, so that we can have conversations that really matter. We see the headlines, but how is that affecting us in our community for the education of our young people? Because we see the age range of what's happening. Hey, Dr. Neil, yeah, it is insane. And
I think the importance here of this discussion and the timeliness of it is, you started off the show talking about Governor Cuomo declaring gun violence emergency. That is supposed to come with some funding, some funding, right?
Right.
So then the question becomes, what is that funding going to go towards, right? Because are you going to use that funding to, say, fund more undercover units, street crime units that are going to make more arrests? Are you going to invest that money in violence interrupters that actually go into the community, know the players, and say, hey, listen,
something like Good Shepherd in the Bragg program,
or Life Camp, Life Camp. My girl Erica Ford.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there's so that's the idea. So I think it's important for the community, when they hear this, to say, once again, listen, we're not saying defund the police. Well, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is coming up with solutions that are actually going to keep us safe. Let's not go back to the old playbook of, let's just lock up all of these young men, throw away the key, and hope that the problem goes away and that the violence goes away. Let's look at holistic solutions that are really going to get at the heart of the problem. It was very refreshing to see at the beginning of this summer increased funding for the Summer Youth Employment Program. That's a biggie. I've always seen it as a biggie growing up. That was my first job. And even when I was chief of youth diversion. We
You
used
had the little card. You had the little card that said
Oh.
SYAV. You know the
Oh
little
yeah,
card,
you
right?
go to the
And you
cash
had
check-in
you had to
spot
check it
to
off,
get the
right? Make sure you were there.
and then you run over to the VIM to
right,
get your
that's
brand new
right.
sneakers.
That's
Yeah, I knows about that.
And I
Believe-
stood there waiting for your check to come through.
Yeah.
Come on through,
My
baby.
son
Come
is
on
waiting for a
through.
check.
Come
My son's
on through.
employment. He
Come
waiting
on
for his
through.
money right now. No, and that's real. And I have interns working with me this summer because of that funding. So it's important for us to talk about the investments that are being made in the community if we are going to hold the government accountable for how these funds are dispersed. And there are programs on the ground that just need support. And we've had other programs or other institutions that have gotten quite a bit of funding, but we don't see any results. So the money is going where? So these are the things when we keep tying it all back together as a community, having the conversations with your elected officials. What are they advocating for? What are they putting on the table? What bills are being voted on? Where are the budget allocations going? You have a right to ask and to get an answer.
And
This participatory democracy.
And on top of that, Dr. Grant, let's spread some of the burden, right? Here, and this is what I mean by spread some of the burden, right?
Hope you don't
I'm not even going to say anything. Just don't go.
Oh man, Maria is so old school.
Don't go down. Don't go down to Southern Boulevard. Just stay away. Stay away from Arthur Avenue.
Your boys stay together.
Stay together. That's right. That's right. Whoever runs the fastest, hey, you got your check. That's how we do. So don't be slow. But I thank you for that comment. It's always nice to have a little levity when we talk about serious matters. And so one of the things that I think of when I say spread the burden is that our educational system, we have all these hybrid schools out here that's supposed to be prep schools and supposed to be culture sensitive and taking care of our own. I don't see anything that's different in those schools program wise. You got math, you got English. I don't see any course that speaks to how I navigate what I need to navigate in that community, whether it is unlawful stops, whether it is what it means to have a gun on your possession and how it can alter your life, whether it is guest speakers, whether this is an extracurriculum course that comes in. Yes, they have a burden as well. Defense counsels have a burden. Civil rights attorneys have a burden. Somebody comes to my office and they get caught with a gun and they want to tell me, oh yeah, the search was illegal, I want to go and sue. I have to put a pause on that. I do. Somebody else might take the case. I have to put a pause on and say, come on, man, this is what we're trying to do. You're going to benefit off of your dirt like that? Like, you dirty. You had the gun. Now, if we're on trial and we're trying to do it, we'll talk about whether your rights are violated. But no, you're done. You coming in and now you're trying to profit. I have an issue with that. So we all have to, but a lot of attorneys do not. Are those same attorneys from the community? I would suggest that they're not, right? And if you start turning away, you start creating the ceiling and the floor, which in our industry really isn't the case. If I look at a case and it looks bad, Ed should be looking at it the same way. It looks bad. And this is me. If uniformity speaks to something. But if you don't have that built in, then you have issues where somebody can get rewarded for doing a bad act. And that's not good for our community.
Oh, no. And I think it also speaks to, there was a philosophy that I think more prosecutors have taken on, which is targeting the drivers of violence. What do I mean, the drivers of violence? We're talking about individuals in the community who are basically, you're talking about your gun traffickers. You're talking about the guy in the background who puts forth, who watches, who supports the violence, but seems to always be able to evade arrest or any sort of consequences of prosecution. What needs to happen is the concentration needs to be on them, not just do this wholesale, let's arrest everybody and whatever happens, happens. I think that's what the community is trying to avoid, because after, 80s, 90s and Rockefeller drug laws, we see what happens when you have mass incarceration and what reverberations and effects that have in the community. I think the modern prosecutor right now is really focusing on because there's a certain set of limited individuals who are responsible for most of the crime, especially, and I know this from experience as somebody who has lived in the hood, grew up in the hood, and still, to a certain degree, keeps himself close to that. You can see it with your own eyes, and you know it. And the hope is that the concentration is on that, because right now we're in a very pivotal moment where certain forces are trying to create a conservative mindset when it comes to dealing with these issues in the community. Remember, we went from a David Dinkins to a Rudolph Giuliani just like that. 2 terms of it. Stop and frisk. What happened after all those years? What did we see? What did we learn? I hope we're not going to look at this moment and just go back to some reactionary conservative mindset. Trust me, I feel the violence in the community. Just last night, my understanding is we had a shooting there on the corner. And I saw some law enforcement out there this afternoon kind of, discussing it. You feel the violence in the community. The question is what we're going to do about it. And let's not repeat the mistakes of the past and how we deal with it.
And I fully understand that. And to our viewers, you have to know what it's like to be shot at. And I ain't sitting up here talking this smack without having that experience where a guy chased you 2 or 3 blocks and he's shooting at you because his friend got fouled on the basketball court and jumped up and wanted to fight, and somebody punched that guy in his head and he fell to the floor. So another guy decides he gonna pull a gun out of his bag and start shooting up the court. I don't know why he chased mine, why he ran in my direction, but I'm telling you, that bullet wasn't going to catch me, boy. I was faster than fast, you know what I'm saying? But when you get shot at and you have to run 3 blocks and you don't know whether you got hit by a car or not because you were running so fast and you're away from your people, you do not want to be on the other side of that. And then when you run into a bodega and the people in the store is like, no, get the hell out. like no, we ain't trying to protect you. You got to get out. And so they sending you right back out into harm's way. That is no joke. That is nothing to play with. So I can see the knee-jerk reaction. And I can almost see myself going over to that side of the aisle, having been part of that. And I didn't know the cat and I didn't do anything to the young man. But we do have to fight against that urge.
And it's so much, and of course we're coming close to the top of the show, and we will be talking about this, unfortunately, moving forward, because of something has to happen. We really want there to be, to your point, Mr. Pichardo, right? There's some solutions and investments that make sense, not going back to what we know doesn't work, but how can we get to that concentrated group that is always involved with the touches in the justice system so that we can stop this unfortunate increase of gun violence. And it's really the investments from birth, from pre-birth. I mean, that's a whole nother show of how we really invest in community and what that looks like. I don't feel that there's one group of people that, all the young people are bad. No, all young people will do certain things, but what are in place to help steer them in a better direction, give them options and choices of what life looks like when you show up a certain way. That's not equal. There is no equity across the board on how our children grow up compared to others who they wouldn't be in that situation. And we know for fact, not for fiction, that law enforcement treats other communities' children differently when they mess up, because they mess up too. It's, oh, don't let me tell your father I'm going to see him playing golf on the weekend, and you make sure you don't do that again, Johnny. So that's a lot different than throwing someone up against the wall, arresting them, they have a record, or capturing them because they had a possession. All children don't make good decisions at some time in their life. How it's handled, it's different. That's just another show with all sorts of implications, from education to housing to employment opportunities, and we can run down the gamut. But in this moment, we need to take responsibility as a community to work with the violence interrupters who are already doing this work. They're up 2-3 o'clock in the morning out on the street, working to stop gun violence, working to stop the crimes. Like, that's where We need to be advocating with our elected officials that more investment is made in proven programs that just need more support so they can reach more people. And a lot of times when you look into it, those who work on the staff of these organizations had touches with the criminal justice system before. They've been there, they've lived it, they understand it, so they can speak to it a little bit better than just coming in with everyone in their police uniforms trying to come in and create a police state. That's what the cry
And
is.
it's going to take a little sacrifice. And what do I mean by that sacrifice? Is that it's going to take folks like Ed, like myself, like Dr. Grant, and plenty of other defense attorneys and other people in other professions to say, although we are making a way and we're making a path in our life to provide for our loved ones in what we're doing right now, we may have to go back to that government institution and kind of bring what we have to the forefront. The time in the past, I used to say, well, of everybody who went to Wharton or everybody who went to, Harvard Business School, they all went corporate. What good is that? We need some of those minds to be in these state agencies, these governmental agencies, to help with the advanced thinking, the advanced know-how, the experience. And so we also have to put that on the table too, because it is a sacrifice.
No, I'm just glad that there are some folks out there talking about treating this problem, this gun violence problem, as a health problem, you know what I mean, in terms of keeping the statistics and the numbers and looking at the real drivers and causes behind it. I mean, you spoke to something that I was able to observe myself, which is in many cases in the community, you will have an otherwise good young person possibly ending up possessing a firearm simply because they feel unsafe, because the level of safety in these communities is not being maintained at the same level that it is in others, and you have young people coming out of their building. That same guy that threatened me with that gun is standing out there every morning. I'm getting ready to go to work, or I'm getting ready to go to school or whatever. What do? I called the cops. The cops are telling me that until he does something, they can't do nothing. So I'm like, so I gotta wait for him to blast my leg off before you do anything. And then even then, it's an issue. So what happens next? So I go ahead and take some drastic course to go on myself, and I'm the one that ends up getting caught.
And you also hear this story. Well, you have a fight today, you have a beef today, and a person will wait a year. Matter of fact, that's in the news just today. Guy waited a whole year. A whole year.
He sued over it.
And then caught my man in the park.
Yep, I waited.
And that was the end.
Yeah,
that was the end. So we have those stories. They come in and out. Those consultations come every single day where we hear those stories. But we at least wanted to provide our viewers and our listeners to have an understanding of what the gun laws are like in New York City. And you could extrapolate that to New Jersey. It's probably less conservative. I mean, it's probably more conservative than New York. So the penalties are higher. And we can go to Connecticut and keep on going on and on. Because there is an underserved community and a gun-ridden community in every state, and it is not always black. And so let's don't get that impression.
Yep. Exactly.
It's just it's a difference of how you treat those who strung out on opioid and those who strung out on crack. Two different ways of how you treat those people and penalize those people. And we just asking for an even playing field. But at least now the law. What the consequences are. And I think that's a big thing. When you start to talk in terms of consequences, I think that kind of curtails and kind of directs behavior. You should only hope for that.
Yeah, we can only hope for that. And Stephen, you mentioned that we in the communities that are affected say those methods didn't work, and conservatives have a different perspective that those methods did work. Yeah, it's a constant back and forth conversation and a whole nother show to get into all of that. But we're raising it, to your point, Mr. Russell. We have to have the conversations, and there are solutions available. There are minds that can come to the table and to think about holistically, how do we solve all the implications? Because there are underlying issues for everything that we're seeing. And in our community, we know what happens. If someone catches a cold, we get pneumonia. So we want to make sure that we're doing our part to be educated and to utilize the process and the system of electing people to actually be held accountable to disperse money as well as resources and to be held accountable. So thank you both. Any final words as we close out today? Mr. Pichardo, over to you.
Well, I just would like to say thank you for joining us today, and I hope the information was helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Russell.
Serious times call for a serious conversation, and these are one of those times. And as much as we can be ahead of the storyline and educate our community, then we'll sit at that place and we'll meet you at that table. So take care and be well.
All right, family. See you next week, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, same place. We appreciate you and thank you, Maria. And we'll see you soon.